You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest, Talmage Boston, wrote a book, How the Best Did It. It's universally acclaimed, and by that I mean it gets reviews like this: a discerning examination of what all of us can learn from some of our most effective leaders. John Meacham, other reviews, all positive. Doris Kearns Goodwin, Evan Thomas, Will Imboden. I could go on and on. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on the podcast. I loved your book.
Thank you. It came out on April the 2nd, so it's been out a little over a month, and I've had the privilege of speaking on it all over the country and getting some national media. In fact, on Sunday, May the 19th, 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, a.m., I'll be the 1 hour guest on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, just me, for an hour. So I'm pretty excited about that. But there's been some other good national media. I did Brian Kilmeade's national radio show. Brett Baer had me on his TV show. And a piece came out today in the Washington Examiner. And it's a book for all Americans who aspire to be better leaders. And it helps if you have an interest in presidential history, because that's really the theme of it. But since we are talking about the greatest leaders of their era and exactly what it was they had, what traits they had that caused them to be so successful, these are traits that anybody who's aspiring to leadership in any organization ought to be thinking about.
And we're going to get you to Indianapolis, too, so you can give a talk.
I'd love that.
Here in the Hoosier State. Leadership, in terms of the great man theory of leadership and his or her effect on history, has taken a bit of a battering in the last generation or so. What made you focus on these singular individuals and their impact on American history?
These individuals have been heroes to me my whole life. I first fell in love with presidential history when I was 7 years old, and I'm now 70 years old, so that's a long time. But I grew up in Houston, and I was there when the Houston Colt 45s came to town, and then the Astrodome was built, and they changed the team name to the Astros. And I collected baseball cards. And so all 6 and 7 year old boys, you get a card, your mind is a sponge, you can remember anything. And so my head was just filled with baseball statistics. And my mother became concerned because on the one hand, she thought she had this real smart little boy, but on the other hand, all he knew about was baseball statistics. So when it came time for my 7th birthday, she went to a bookstore and she found a booklet that contained presidential trading cards. And on the outside was a picture of the president. On the back, when he was born, when he died, when he was president, what were the most important things. And just as I had done with the baseball cards, I remembered everything on the back of the presidential trading cards. And those years, the early 60s, was when America was celebrating the centennial of the Civil War. Of course, the great hero was Abraham Lincoln. And a lot of children's biographies of Abraham Lincoln and of course, Ulysses Grant, who later became president. So anyway, early on, I had a fascination with it. My first two books were about baseball history, but by the time I finished my second, I'd pretty much written about everything in baseball history that I truly cared about. My third book was on legal history, since I've been a lawyer for 46 years. But my last two have been on presidential history, and that's really where the main focus of my interest has been the last several years, and I think will continue. The more you know about so many of these presidents, the more fascinating they become. And what I'm trying to do with this book is what's called applied history. It's one thing to know history, enjoy history. It's something else to be able to apply history to your daily living. And so that's what this book is, for people to read it, grasp what these 8 presidents did, and then be able to turn around and apply it to how they run their company or their nonprofit or their law firm or radio station or whatever it may be, to be more effective leaders.
The presidents you chose are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ronald Reagan. We'll get to each of them in just a second. You mentioned baseball, so forgive me while I change the subject for 2 seconds. I am about to record a podcast that's about Pete Rose. It's brand new, called Charlie Hustle. Does he belong in the Hall of Fame? Yes or no?
No.
When you take on presidents, you have to penetrate the myth first, right? To get to the man, to get to his actions. Of all the presidents that you have studied or have written about in this book, which one of them has the greatest mythology?
I think you'd have to say John F. Kennedy, because with each of my 8 chapters on the 8 presidents, as a part of it, toward the end of the chapter, I identify their flaws. The focus of the book is on the great things they did, but as Ken Burns likes to say, we need to explore the full emotional archaeology, which means you also have to address each man's flaws, and they were all flawed, as we all are. And so in the John F. Kennedy chapter, in terms of the mythology that first John Kennedy and then his family and his people involved in his presidential library tried to create, in particular around his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was largely false, and that was all revealed once the tape recordings of the 13 days, 42 hours of executive committee meetings and joint chiefs of staffs meetings and so forth were finally made available to scholars in the 1990s. Did it become clear that much had been misreported and perpetuated that was simply not accurate? When you do boil down all of the facts, as I demonstrate in the chapter, he was in fact heroic. He was in fact the cool head, the calm voice and mind who made truly great decisions that avoided World War III and nuclear holocaust, says that John F. Kennedy deserves to be recognized as the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But to feel like you've come out of it with a complete understanding of what happened, you have to take away a lot of the manufactured stuff that the Kennedy family tried to perpetuate during the 60s and thereafter. But once the tape recordings came out, had to acknowledge the obvious in terms of what really happened.
Are presidents the same? Let's stick with Kennedy for a second. I've done a couple of podcasts on the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically, and then obviously with Mark Updegrove, who wrote about Kennedy and the administration. Are presidents like ball players, no matter what the sport? They get the big things right, or they have the game-winning drive, or they hit the game-winning home run or basket. Those are the ones we remember.
Sure. Who Wants People in Jest have said, okay, Talmage, for your next book, why don't you title it How the Worst Did It, and talk about all the things that they did that caused them to be ineffective leaders, and therefore people who are aspiring to be leaders can say, this is what I want to avoid doing. And I say, no, I don't want to spend 2 years of my life researching why Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan and Warren Harding and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Jimmy Carter were all such ineffective presidents. That's not how I want to spend my time. I like to focus on the positive and not on the negative. And and I'm by nature an optimist. I like to look on the bright side of presidential history, not so much the dismal side, although when you're evaluating how good and how bad presidents were, you do, with respect to many of them, have to recognize the scar on their presidency: Nixon, Watergate, Johnson, Vietnam, Clinton, Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones and Whitewater, that caused otherwise fine presidents to get knocked off the rails when you're thinking about great presidents.
The first, make sure I get this right. I do. The first 4 presidents you profile: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Teddy, make up our current Mount Rushmore. If you were in charge, Talmage Boston, in charge completely of choosing the next 4 presidents for Mount Rushmore Part 2, would you choose Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ronald Reagan?
Yes. And this isn't just me. People ask me, you're saying these are the 8 best presidents. What was your criteria for choosing the 8 best? And the answer is, for the most part, I accepted the conclusions of the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll. Every time a president leaves the White House and a new president comes in, C-SPAN does a poll of the country's 150 leading historians and asks them to rank presidents from best to worst on the basis of what they perceive the 10 most important presidential leadership traits. And you can Google C-SPAN presidential ranking poll and read all about it. The last 2 times they've done the polls, 2017 when Obama went out and Trump came in, 2021 when Trump went out and Biden came in, the results of the top 9 are identical. 1 Lincoln, 2 Washington, 3 FDR, 4 Theodore Roosevelt, 5 Eisenhower, 6 Truman, 7 Jefferson, 8 Kennedy, 9 Reagan. The only adjustment that I made to the C-SPAN poll was that I took Truman out and I moved Reagan up a notch. And that's because, number one, I think Truman is overrated. He got us into Korea and had no idea how to get us out. He did nothing to effectively deal with McCarthyism. He gets some credit for having the courage to drop the A-bombs and thereby bring about the end of World War II. All the reading I've done on that is there was no way he could have decided otherwise. We had spent so much time and money on the Manhattan Project, and if we didn't drop the bombs, then American forces were going to have to invade Japan, and hundreds of thousands of Americans would have lost their lives. It was, from my perspective, a no-brainer. And the best thing that ever happened to Harry Truman was David McCullough wrote a Pulitzer biography of him. So anyway, I pulled Truman out. I moved Reagan up. I'm trying to sell my book to both Democrats and Republicans. So in the modern era, I wanted to balance 2 Democrats, FDR and JFK, 2 Republicans, Eisenhower and Reagan. I think in 2024, people are more interested in reading about Reagan than Truman. But I also am making a statement in this era of high political polarization. And I want Democrats to be able to read and recognize that we have had, in the modern era, truly great Republican presidents. And I want Republicans to recognize that in the modern era, we have had truly great Democratic presidents. And so if I had gone exactly with the C-SPAN ranking and limited it to 8, then Truman would have been in and Reagan would have been out, and I wouldn't have had the balance. I wouldn't have been able to convey that message. But I'll stand by and argue any day as to why Reagan belongs in the top 8 and Truman doesn't. H.W. Brands, who's a leading historian, 2-time Pulitzer finalist, who wrote a wonderful biography of Reagan, said, what FDR was to the first half of the 20th century, Reagan was to the second half of the 20th century. And then Richard Reeves, who wrote a biography of Reagan, said that what FDR was to liberals, Reagan was to conservatives. So to think that Reagan should not be. Reagan, semi-scarred, but not wholly scarred, but semi-scarred by Iran-Contra. And I talk about that. And in the flaws section on Reagan, he was always up here 50,000 feet and big picture and long-term vision. He was not a detail guy, and he let things get away from him during Iran-Contra when unfortunately he no longer had James Baker as his White House chief of staff. James Baker and Don Regan had switched, and Baker's second term was Secretary of Treasury, and Don Regan's second term was White House Chief of Staff. And both Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan said that if James Baker had been Chief of Staff during the second term, Iran-Contra never would have happened. Anyway, I'm perfectly content with my choices, and that's how I arrived at them. But I also realize that there's always room for discussion and debate. And had I had 9 presidents in my book, the ninth surely would have been Harry Truman.
I just finished a book, a brand new book about Reagan. It's called The Search for Reagan by Craig Shirley. He's coming on the podcast, and he talks about some of the things that you just mentioned. As a kid who basically became a Republican, like many of our generation, I was born in 1967 because of President Reagan. I enjoyed both Mr. Shirley's take and what you had to say, including the flaws. Let me go back just for a second to the poll. That I think it's Arthur Schlesinger who started the modern ranking of presidents.
That's right.
Like in 60 or 62, or maybe even late 50s, after he became famous for The Age of Jackson and all the history books that he wrote. But of course, he was firmly ensconced in Camelot, as you referenced earlier with he and Mrs. Kennedy. But presidential polls have taken an interesting turn in the last few decades. If you would have told Arthur Schlesinger or Bruce Catton 60 years ago that a lot of people consider Grant to be a better president than Woodrow Wilson, they'd have thought you were tasting the mulberry squeezins. How in the world does the polling change so much, in your opinion?
There's 2 main factors. Number one, as the years go by, we learn more about each president. Old letters are uncovered, or facts come to light that had never been known before. In Woodrow Wilson's case, people had no idea he was such a total bigot, a racial bigot. Of course, once that brand gets placed on your forehead in the historian world, those are serious black marks. And so that explains in large part why Wilson's stature has been declining over the past several years. And then as far as Grant goes, during his 2 terms, 8 years, there was all kinds of scandal that occurred. He was not directly involved in it. He didn't really know it was going on until it was too late. And nobody ever has found any evidence that he in any way knowingly participated in it. But nonetheless, it's like Iran-Contra. You're the president. Your job is to know what's going on. You have to take responsibility for what the people in your administration are doing. And so because of that, over 100 years or thereabouts, Grant was always a bottom half ranked president. But because of some new biographies that have come out, excuse me, in the last few years, by Ron Chernow, by Ronald White, by H.W. Brands, and this awareness that during the Reconstruction era, Grant was proactive to get the American Army to attempt to stop the lynching and all the bad stuff that was going on in the South. And so he gets lots of positive strokes for that when that wasn't really recognized until fairly recently. So that's number one in terms of new facts arise and historians become aware of it, and it reorients their conclusions about the effectiveness of a particular president. But the second factor is that so many historians evaluate presidents not on the social consciousness that existed during that president's time in the White House, but instead they impose 21st century social consciousness and apply that standard to how this guy was doing in 1880 or whatever it was. And one of my favorite interviews over the years was in 2013 when I interviewed John Meacham on his then new biography of Thomas Jefferson. And I asked John, I said, all right, John, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question. Let's assume that it is 2013, but let's assume that there is no building in Washington, D.C. called the Jefferson Memorial. It does not exist. We just have the Lincoln Memorial, we have the Washington Monument. That's it. Let's then assume that tomorrow a congressman submits a bill that provides for federal funding to be used for the construction of a Jefferson Memorial at a prominent place in Washington, D.C. That's the assumption. That's the hypothetical. Knowing what we now know about what was going on with Jefferson and the slaves at Monticello, does that bill get passed today? And John paused and smiled and said, no, that bill doesn't get passed today. And keep in mind, this was at least 7 years before the cancel culture kicked in. But because of what we know today about Jefferson, if we had no Mount Rushmore today,
right,
and we said, okay, how about if we chisel bus into the South Dakota mountain of our four greatest presidents, Jefferson would not be on there. In fact, I don't even know if in a lot of people's minds, I don't know that he'd make the top 8. And I still think Louisiana Purchase and the way he succeeded in coming out of, from my perspective, the very bad John Adams presidency, where Adams and the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize President Adams or any Federalist policy. And people were actually imprisoned for exercising their freedom of speech and freedom of the press rights. But fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its own terms at the end of Adams' presidency. But that's the nation that Jefferson was coming into and would be the president. And so we had to bring the people back together, at least in part. And so Jefferson did an exceptional job of relentlessly pursuing positive relationships with people on both sides of the aisle that brought down the hostility and thereby got the country off to a much better start at the start of the 19th century. So I believe Jefferson is in the top 8, but in terms of political correctness and cancel culture and what was going on with Sally Hemings, she was 14 years old when she went to Europe and he was over there. And by the time she's 16, she's pregnant. When she comes back to the United States with Jefferson, and they end up having 7 kids, I think 5 lived to adulthood. And was it consensual? Was it not consensual? She was a slave. He had his way, and they'd made their deal in Europe that if she would continue this, then when he died, she and her children would be freed. So she made that deal, and Jefferson, in fact, abided by that deal and emancipated her children and upon his death. So it's all very complicated, but it's particularly complicated when we're looking at it from a 21st century social consciousness, as opposed to the way things were in the early 1800s. So those are the factors in play that cause rankings to change.
Let me ask you a question about that very thing. So Washington and Jefferson, slave owners, 18th century slave owners, they stay in the top 5, in the top 10. Washington's either second or third, depending on the poll. Sometimes Franklin Roosevelt leapfrogs. They don't suffer for owning slaves, but Woodrow Wilson suffers. He was an inveterate racist. There's no doubt about that. He resegregated so much of the United States. So many of his policies were just absolutely hostile to African Americans. His reputation suffers. I mean, being a bigot is a terrible thing, but to me, it doesn't really compare with actually owning people.
Well, I think, again, you have to look at the era when Washington and Jefferson, who both owned large plantations, thousands of acres, and in order to, quote, make a living off of agriculture on large plantations, even if you had 10 kids, that wasn't enough. And there was not a stream of immigration coming over from Europe. That didn't happen until later. And our founding fathers in the Constitution had recognized the legality of slavery. And thus, if you were going to make your plantation have any chance of producing crops that potentially could result in a profitable operation, there's no source for manpower saving except for slaves. And if it's legal and that's the only way you can make your plantation work, then you can understand why Washington and Jefferson doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean slavery was the right thing or a good thing, but from an economic standpoint of how things worked in agriculture on large plantations, nobody who had large plantations was emancipating their slaves, because you might as well just sell all your land and do something else. People didn't do that. Wilson, on the other hand, long after the 13th Amendment has passed and slavery, all that's behind, and he's just being a total racist bigot and saying all kinds of things and
screening birth of a nation in the White House.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. And so that we can look at Woodrow Wilson in his time and say, I don't get it, and particularly recognizing his religious upbringing. His father was a minister. And Wilson was a man of deep faith. And so how can you think that way? What caused Washington to finally change his mind about slavery such that in his final will, he freed the slaves that he owned, was he had seen how heroically they had fought in the Revolutionary War. And this ate at him to think that, my gosh, these people have been courageous and many of them have given their lives and they're still enslaved. And then, of course, Lincoln was of a mind, once he got, after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect and runaway slaves from the South joined the Union Army to the tune of 200,000 soldiers and were instrumental to victory. Of course, they've got to be emancipated if people are sacrificing their lives. And so here's Wilson, who had been president during World War I and had seen, I guess maybe our armies weren't integrated in World War I. Maybe there weren't black soldiers in World War I. I hadn't thought about that. But anyway, we were far enough along that Wilson should not have been saying the things he said or thinking the things he thought, particularly with his religious perspective. That's just irreconcilable.
And he had a significant education, obviously, PhD. Right. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our conversation is with Talmage Boston. We're discussing his terrific book, How the Best Did It: Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. I also want to ask you about a president about whom I know very little, and it's a serious error on my part. But in sticking up for Grant, I also want to say that he was probably, his reputation took serious damage because of the prevalence of the lost cause historians throughout.
No doubt.
The early 20th all the way through the night, Douglas Southall Freeman and them, who couldn't imagine that Grant was a better man than Lee. And he, quite frankly, was a better man than Lee in every way possible, in my view.
I think people there, I am not a Robert E. Lee expert, but I've lived in Texas almost my entire life. And I have many friends who still think Robert E. Lee hung the moon. And I've heard them enough to think that Lee had many honorable traits, but obviously he was the leader of the Confederate Army. But Grant, I don't think Grant's ever going to be a top 10 president because of all of the things that went on during his presidency involving shady dealings and so forth, and his inability to keep abreast of them or do anything about them. But we all have good, we all have bad. Some have more, seem to have more good than bad. And over time, we learn more good. And in some cases, we learn more bad. And that's why these rankings change. Somebody asked me about James Polk, who in some polls had gone as high as 12. And yet in the 2021, all of a sudden he's 18. And so of course, there are different historians who participate in these polls over time. So you can understand why there's always going to be some changes. But as you've mentioned, sometimes there's rather dramatic changes. To me, the most interesting of the changes was Eisenhower. And that is John F. Kennedy in 1960 ran for president against Richard Nixon, who'd been Eisenhower's vice president. And Kennedy's whole thrust was, Ike's 70 years old. He's so damn old. He just plays golf. There's a missile gap and Sputnik, and we're behind, and we need a new frontier and youth and all this kind of stuff. And he gets elected. And of course, Schlesinger is running the polls. So anyway, here's Eisenhower, who comes in like 21st place out of 32. So he's like in the bottom 1/3 in 1962. And yet today he's number 5. And you say, my gosh, how did that happen? What happened was that when he left the White House, the president's papers are confidential for a while, but then they're released. And when the historians got into his papers, they realized, oh my gosh, this guy was in the big middle of everything. He was making all these terrific decisions. And Harry Truman once said it takes 50 years for the dust to settle before you can really evaluate a historical legacy. And it took a while for people to say, 8 years of peace and prosperity. Wow. Nobody
he even handled Sputnik right.
I mean, everything. And Kennedy, 2 days into office, already knows that his claiming that there's a missile gap is a total lie. But anyway, be that as it may, to see Eisenhower ranking change upward in such a uniquely huge way over time is fun to see. And for people who take the time to study Eisenhower and his presidency, you get it. And in my Eisenhower chapter, the way he handled McCarthyism, the way he handled the Suez Crisis, the way he handled Little Rock in 1957, the way he brought an end to the Korean War that Harry Truman had no idea how to bring it into. And these are, of course, the interstate highway. So anyway, it's fun to see how perceptions change. But going back to me being an optimist, want to be positive, somebody who I can now say, man, he was great. And he's getting the recognition he deserves.
Going back to your Grant, he may never make top 10 most important presidents or greatest president. But to me, no list of the 10 most important Americans is valid unless it includes Ulysses S. Grant.
I think a very good argument can be made in support of that point, because after all, had he not taken over the Union Army and had he not done what he did, who knows how long that war would have gone on, because there was nobody else who seemed to get it in terms of what it was going to take to defeat the Confederate Army. And it was bloody, and there were tens of thousands of deaths in the last several months. It was a hard war, but Grant refused to retreat. He was just all in, relentless, didn't give Lee a break, came up with a strategy involving Sherman and taking over Atlanta and the March to the Sea, and all that ultimately led to victory. Had he not been there, who knows how long the Civil War would have gone on. But
to me, he's the most compelling person of the war, even more than Lincoln. I know that's probably minority, but for Grant in 6 months before the Civil War, Grant was selling firewood on the street to feed his family. In 1864, 4 years later, he's the first merit lieutenant general since George Washington, only in America.
Yeah, and you and I can at a later time. I can
Well,
explain to you why Lincoln should be rated over Grant as a Civil War hero, but that's for another day.
you are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest is Talmage Boston. He has written a terrific new book, which has amazing reviews from the top historians writing today: Ronald White, Douglas Brinkley, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Evan Thomas. I want to ask you about a president, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, and I simply just don't know a lot about him. He is always on the list of the greatest, most impactful, most influential, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. What makes Roosevelt special, Teddy?
Theodore Roosevelt, who became president at age 42 and thereby became the youngest president we've ever had. John F. Kennedy became the youngest elected president at age 43. But Theodore Roosevelt came in because McKinley had been assassinated. But in terms of what made him unique, number one, I think he is the highest IQ president we've ever had. He read more than anybody. Whatever he read, he had a photographic memory. It stayed in his brain. He wrote more books than any president. He was always one step ahead in his thinking. And so he was truly brilliant. He also was truly electric with his personality during his presidency in a very positive way that invigorated the country, got the new century off to a very strong, bold start. And in large part because he was thinking in ways of how the presidency needed to be expanded for the good of the American people. Trusts were creating monopolies and causing the very rich to get ever richer to the detriment of everybody who was not in that classification. And so he got his Justice Department to pursue Sherman Act claims that did major damage to the trusts. And so that was a good thing for there not to be this monopoly on wealth as there was. He also, a year into his presidency, there was the Great American Coal Strike of 1902, whereby the coal miners went on strike, and it had gone on for months, and there was absolutely no progress being made with the coal owners, and we were headed toward the winter. And if it wasn't resolved, half the country was going to freeze to death because there wasn't any coal. And so no American president had ever gotten involved in a labor dispute before. But Roosevelt said, I'm the president. I don't want to have the country to freeze to death. So he got the sides together and he acted as mediator and kept brainstorming with his genius potential ideas that could serve as the basis for resolution and common ground. And ultimately they did agree on binding arbitration to bring an end to it. And so problem solved, nobody froze to death, but there was a new area of presidential power to take responsibility for national strikes that could potentially have devastating impact on the American society. But he also was taking initiatives with national parks and wildlife refuges. So he was thinking in terms of the ways that presidential power could be expanded. And those are the areas that people recognize for what made him exceptional. And normally, to be rated a top president, you have to have done something great in the context of a major crisis. The coal strike was a bad crisis, but it wasn't the Civil War, and it wasn't the Great Depression, and it wasn't World War II, and it wasn't the Revolutionary War. And so that's why here's Lincoln #1, Civil War; Washington #2, Revolutionary War; FDR #3, Great. And here's Theodore Roosevelt. We didn't have any wars during his presidency, and we didn't have any major crises, and yet, and I forgot to mention the Panama Canal, all these things that he's taking responsibility for, and he's being proactive to make things better. for the American people, and to be a number 4 rated without a major crisis during your presidency is amazing. But as I point out in the chapter, and this is straight out of Edmund Morris's wonderful trilogy on Theodore Roosevelt, the first one was called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which was from birth up until he became president. That one won the Pulitzer. The second one was on Theodore Roosevelt during his presidential years. And then the third one was called Colonel Roosevelt, which is what he'd like to be called post-presidency. He left the White House when he was 50 years old. He died when he was 60 years old. So during that last decade, all this electric personality and overachieving and never resting and just relentlessly seizing the day every single day caused him ultimately to twist off.
Yeah.
And the
you
last
make that point very brilliantly in your book. He's not a president that I know a lot about. Even as I said, that's a failing of mine. But your point of he had all this kinetic energy, but yet now what are you going to do? Which is why he begged Wilson to go back over to go to World War I. He wanted to go fight.
Yeah. And then when Wilson said no, he then pushed his sons onto the front lines. And of course, one of them got killed.
Yeah. Quentin.
And so some people say that he died at age 60 of a broken heart because he knew that he had pushed Quentin into war and he got killed.
And then I guess we should mention that his son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., received the Medal of Honor.
Yeah, man.
His actions on D-Day.
Was badly wounded. He spent the rest of his life with his injury. So anyway, war is hell. And that is interesting to see how in the old days, the children of presidents joined the war and saw combat. And Franklin Roosevelt's sons did during World War II. And of course, that doesn't happen anymore.
Let me ask you about Franklin Roosevelt. I just read a book and recorded a podcast with David Roll. I don't know if you know who David is, but he wrote
I've seen his name.
He's a terrific biography.
Oh, he wrote that one. It's about Ascent.
Ascent to Power.
Yeah, about Truman.
You won't like it.
I got a big review in the Wall Street Journal.
I'm going to tell you, it's an excellent book. It's not hagiographical, but I think it's very pro Truman. Maybe it'll change your mind. I don't know. But what I come back to on Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm sure this is black and white as opposed to maybe the culture and the temperature of what he brought to the presidency. I have not read a book, and correct me, please, that argues the Great Depression was cured by the New Deal.
That's true. I don't think anybody would claim otherwise.
And yet he gets so much credit for his actions through the New Deal. Am I wrong in thinking that's somewhat counterintuitive?
He gets credit for inspiring an optimistic spirit in the American people that somehow, some way, we are going to get past this Great Depression, that obviously Herbert Hoover did not have the ability to inspire optimism at all. And FDR was highly proactive, and some of his programs hit and some of them missed. Some of them were effective, some of them weren't. But at least he was doing everything he could think of to try to get the country out of the ditch. But as you point out, and as basically all historians agree, the only thing that brought the country out of the Great Depression was the necessity of developing the great American war machine, which was necessary for us to be in a position to ultimately win World War II. So, but we can't take away from the fact that FDR was calming panic in his first week as president. In his first term, there was this panic on the banks. People were pulling all their money out, putting it in mattresses, and then FDR declares a bank holiday, he called it, and he closes all the bank to stop the panic. And then he does his first ever fireside chat 8 days into his presidency, where he basically says, let's calm down. Here's what we've done. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the road that lies ahead. There's no need to panic. And the next day they open the banks and the panic is gone. So his massaging of the national psyche to feel like somehow we're going to get through this. And we have a president who's going to do any and everything possible to get us through this. Some of it'll work, some of it won't, but at least we know he's given it all he's got. Accounts for the fact that in 1932 and then 1936 and then 1940, before we had gotten involved in World War II, FDR wins 3 blowout elections in which he gets over 80% of the electoral votes. Now, he gets reelected in 1944. Of course, we've been in World War II, and that was more on the basis of the war. But the first 3 were on the basis of the Depression. And so regardless of whether you want to look back and say, he really didn't solve the Depression. That's right. But he did put Americans in a much better frame of mind, thinking that we were going to get out of it sooner or later, and that we had a president who was going to make us feel like he was doing all that government could do to bring us out of the ditch. And that gets to the notion of bully pulpit. He used the bully pulpit to give the people hope, to give the people perseverance, and that's huge.
I was just going to say, and he also, I think, we don't know them all, obviously, but had the best presidential voice, this real beautiful voice. And I guess we should mention poor Alf Landon, 523-8. He loses in 19.
I think there have been 3, to my knowledge, there have been 3 great. Of course, we don't have recordings of Lincoln's voice. We hear, but he had a high-pitched voice that when you first heard it, you thought, how in the world could this guy be persuasive? But if you tried to listen, then all of a sudden you realize, my God, every word that's coming out of his mouth is brilliant. But in terms of the voice on a medium that the American people could hear on the radio or on television, there have been 3 great voices, and that is FDR and JFK and Reagan. They had the capacity to inspire the country like.
I didn't vote for him, but I also thought that the cadence and the phrasing of Barack Obama sometimes was.
Here's the difference. But Barack Obama, yes. When you heard him, when you saw him on television, the cadence, the eloquence, the vocabulary, the presence, you thought, damn, wow, I needed to hear that. That's truly great oratory. But then when you step back and you say, okay, yeah, it was, but what did it accomplish? And in particular, you look at what JFK did with his oratory. You look at what Reagan did with his oratory, that not only does it sound good and powerful and eloquent, but it actually inspires Congress or the nation to go out and do something great. And that's the missing link on the Obama oratory, that as magical and beautiful to the ears as it was, that's how he became president. It was on the basis of oratory. You think, man, that guy's great. And then he gives that speech in 2004. All of a sudden, here's this obscure Illinois politician, and people say, oh my God, he ought to be president. Next thing you know, he is. But then when you step back and you look at his 8 years and the oratory and say, yeah, but what came out of it?
You mentioned polls, and there was a recent poll. And by recent, I think in the last 2 or 3 years, I couldn't find it because I wanted to be more exact, but I couldn't find it. And it was a rating of presidents and so on and so forth. And they rated, and this has been a recurring theme. Maybe it's changing, and you can tell me if it is or if it should change. In rating presidents, Ronald Reagan was rated the luckiest president. That seems to be consistent, and it also seems to be somewhat denigrating, like Gorbachev just appeared out of nowhere. What do you think of Reagan's rating among historians who are majored in history and have a graduate degree in medieval history? I've taken enough history classes to know professors aren't exactly, I don't know that I had too many Reaganite professors. So let's just say that right there. But the rating of him as lucky, to me, that diminishes Reagan's accomplishments.
I think it does diminish it, but on the other hand, every president has a certain amount of luck. And Reagan certainly had his share. He inherited Paul Volcker as the head of the Fed, who was instrumental in getting inflation under control after Jimmy Carter's double-digit inflation. And Volcker is recognized as being the right guy at the right time as far as that was concerned. Reagan was lucky in terms of, on his watch, the Soviet economy went in the tank. And in 1985, at the beginning of the second term, Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was the first one we'd had in years, or the Soviets had in years, who we could actually deal with and do business with and negotiate with and make progress with. So those were all very fortunate circumstances that were instrumental in the success of the Reagan presidency. The residue of design, that phrase, I think Branch Rickey said it first, but every president has a certain amount of luck, and a good luck and bad luck. So I can't even imagine how to go about ranking who's more lucky than the other guy. That just doesn't seem like something that is going to bear any fruit, just because of the nature of.
Well, Eisenhower had Stalin die in, I think, 1953, so he didn't have to deal with that. The list goes on.
Lucky. Yeah.
I am embarrassed here in the final minutes we have on the Leaders and Legends podcast before I ask you the same 5 questions that we ask all of our guests. We're talking to Talmage Boston. His book is How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Profiles of Reagan, Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson. But number 1 and number 2 we haven't hit yet. And that's George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Is it too much to say they are the 2 most important Americans who ever lived?
I think you could certainly make a compelling argument that what you just said is true. Had it not been for George Washington, I don't think we would have won the Revolutionary War. I don't know that we would have prevailed at the Constitutional Convention in coming up with a document that everybody could agree on and that the states could ratify, or that we could have gotten the nation off to a better start in terms of setting precedents and the operation of how government worked than we did during Washington's 2 terms. And Washington is definitely one of the 2. And of course, Lincoln, to come into office after 7 states have already seceded with more to follow, and to preside over the country as commander-in-chief during the only civil war we've ever had, where over 750,000 people lost their lives, and to take responsibility in achieving the ultimate abolition of slavery, which nobody could have pulled off but Lincoln. And that's obviously the biggest stain on the history in American history of our country. I can't think of anybody who would give those 2 guys competition for being worthy of being first or second, because those 2 guys did so much that was so important.
And this leads me to my last question before the 5 questions. And actually, I could tell you've been interviewed before, Mr. Boston. You've led me right into it. Yet for each one of these presidents, including Washington and Lincoln, you have a section in your book about their flaws. Why was that important to you? And of these 8, who do you think was the most flawed?
I think it's important that Washington wasn't perfect and Lincoln wasn't perfect. And I happen to be a person of the Christian faith, and I think that Jesus Christ was perfect, but I don't think any other man has come close. And as far as Americans in history, I think Lincoln had the fewest flaws, and so my section on him is shorter. And Washington, as a slave holder until the bitter end, even though he had these strong feelings about how wrong it was, and yet he didn't really, quote, do anything until his will at the end of his death. But I think it makes historical figures more approachable for the reader and for the student of history to not think that anybody was perfect or close to perfect. But nonetheless, they still did great things. And so we, in our own lives, need to be in the business of grasping the great things that people have done and seeing what we can learn from them. And that's the purpose of my book.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Boston, are you ready?
Yes.
What was your first job?
My first job was mowing lawns in our neighborhood in Houston when I was in the 4th grade.
What was your first concert?
The first concert was in elementary school when members of the Houston Orchestra came and played, in my first real introduction to classical music, and it was uplifting.
Did you ever meet Van Cliburn?
Van Cliburn lived in Fort Worth, and I'm in Dallas, and he wasn't out and about except in high society in Fort Worth. I was there for the opening of the Rangers ballpark in 1994, and Van Cliburn was there and played the Star Spangled Banner. I think that was the only time I was ever in the same place as Van Cliburn.
Third question. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I think John Meacham's newest book on Lincoln, And There Was Light, is a book that's worthy of anybody's attention to fully appreciate not only Lincoln's greatness, but the process that caused him to be great. And John's a spectacular writer and knows how to make a historical argument and knows how to touch the heart. So that book comes to mind. I guess the other one, if we were talking about fiction, a book that really had an impact on me as a novel was Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, which I read in college, and still passages in it have stayed embedded in my brain for over 50 years.
Do you think Lincoln could have been even greater if he had married someone else, or happier?
He could have been happier because Mary Todd Lincoln was a shrew, but we have to give Mary some credit. She was a very smart woman and she was a very ambitious woman.
Exactly.
And Lincoln benefited by those two traits, but she was always causing friction. She was doing nutty things like going on these wild shopping trips and buying things that they could never afford. She associated with shady characters. She basically accepted bribes from taking money on the basis that she would get Lincoln to pay attention to something. Lincoln definitely would have been happier if he'd had a different temperament, but certainly she was instrumental because she recognized his capacity to be a great leader early on before they even got engaged. She said, "Hey, I think this guy could be president." And she was very ambitious. She knew a woman in the 19th century was going to be president. The best a woman could do would be married to a president. She picked him out, and she was right.
Question number 4. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I guess I'd like to have been there at the Gettysburg battlefield on the day he gave the Gettysburg Address, just
November 19th.
Appreciation for what had happened, what the mood was. Here was the guy who preceded Lincoln, who spoke for 2 hours, and then Lincoln spoke for 2.5 minutes and said more in 2.5 minutes than the guy had said 2 hours, which the guy even I think those are the most immortal words ever spoken. And the close second is his second inaugural address. So both of those circumstances and to hear those magic words and to hear his voice say those magic words would be something I would have loved.
Poor Edward Everett.
Edward Everett, that was the name. That's right.
You have come closer to the object of the occasion in 2 minutes than I did in 2 hours.
Right.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
It might be Gary Kasparov.
The chess player who has been
who is now among the most brilliant political thinkers in the world and writes brilliant op-ed pieces for the Wall Street Journal. And I heard him speak at SMU a few years ago, and he was just dazzling, and he's involved in something called the Strategic Defense or Strategic Democracy Initiative or something like that. Mm. And I just think the guy's brilliant, and to come out of this chess world where he was the world champion, which in and of itself makes somebody brilliant, but then to be able to apply that kind of genius to political thinking, I think he's the guy that comes to mind.
Yeah, I would say calling him a chess player undersells it quite a bit. He's one of the greatest players of all time.
Yes.
Speaking of brilliance, here's your chance to say hi to Ambassador Ken Edelman.
Is Ken on?
I'm going to get him on so that he can say things about you. He's going to redo his book about Reagan at Reykjavik, and I'm going to make sure I ask him about you. I want to say thank you to Ambassador Edelman for helping connect us.
Ken, I quote Ken in my book and his Reagan at Reykjavik, and he and I got to be friends being on the board of the Better Angel Society, which is the nonprofit that raises money for Ken Burns' wonderful films. And I saw Ken do a program at the LBJ Library with H.W. Brands on Reagan and Reykjavik, and Ken's a special person.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Talmage Boston, the author of How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Mr. Boston, thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and we hope to see you soon here in Indianapolis.
I would love that. I've never been to Indianapolis, and I've certainly enjoyed being on your show, Robert, and everything I know about your podcast is very impressive, and so I hope your number of listeners continues to grow.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.